Hello everyone, welcome to the YouTube channel of Get Set Law by IMS. I'm your verbal ability mentor Sanjana ma'am, and today let's discuss a very important topic under critical reasoning, something that I have experienced most students have a fear of, which is assumptions, right? So as the title suggests, I'm going to explain how to decode assumptions, and more so I would want to focus on the fundamentals here. I would not wish to solve very challenging or tricky questions. It's better that we focus on fundamentals and the basics of it so that dealing with the challenging questions becomes a whole lot easier going forward. All right, so let's discuss this.
To book a free one-on-one law counseling online or at any IMS center, check out the link in the description box or the pinned comment below.
What is an assumption? Simply put, what I've done here on the screen, as you can see, is I've just broken down the entire technicalities of it. Whatever the definition is, I'm dividing it into bite-sized pieces. Firstly, an assumption is an unstated premise. Never forget this. It's an unstated premise. What a premise is, I'll explain it. So essentially, if you take a look at any paragraph or a passage or something that is popularly referred to as an argument also, it comprises premise or premises and a conclusion. So a premise is nothing. It's essentially the fact, a piece of evidence, a reason which when you use to arrive at a conclusion makes the entire statement an argument. So premises are nothing but the facts using which you arrive at a conclusion, and conclusion is the main point of the passage. It's the very claim that I'm trying to convince my readers of, right? So an assumption is nothing. It's an unstated premise. What does it mean? It is an implied statement. It is a hidden statement, right? It's a latent statement. It is not directly given. If it were directly given in the passage, then you would not call it an assumption. It's something which is right off the bat given. It's a premise only. But here it's implied. It's a fact that you take for granted, which you feel that you don't have to mention in the passage. Alright, it must be true for the conclusion to logically follow from the premises. So let me just write down a very potent statement here. The validity of a conclusion depends on the validity of the assumption, which means in order for the conclusion to be true, the assumption has to be true. It is that important for the conclusion to be true in the passage. And then it is a hidden link. I've already explained that an assumption is an unstated fact in the passage, right? So it is a hidden link that supports the argument. So these are the technicalities of it. So how do you essentially explain it? All right. Now focus on what I have here, right? You have a premise which I've already mentioned. It's a fact, the reason, a piece of evidence using which you arrive at the conclusion. Conclusion is the main point that I try to convince my readers of. And this is how any argument is generally structured. You have a premise and you have a conclusion, and then you have another premise which is hidden. Hence I'm writing it in brackets, and this is nothing but our assumption. So can I say that an assumption fills the gap between a premise and a conclusion? When you include an assumption as well in the passage, it cements your conclusion. It solidifies the conclusion. It makes the passage more cogent, right? It makes the passage more logical, right? So these are the basics of it. If you are able to remember this structure, much of critical reasoning, being able to decode it, not just with respect to assumptions, but also with respect to solving strengthening and weakening questions, it becomes a whole lot easier. Now, let's try to understand all of this that I've explained with the help of an example. All right, here you have a premise which says all humans need water to survive. A very simple statement. I don't have to decode it here for you. And then you have a conclusion, which is therefore, if someone is human, they need water. Very simple. So you have a premise and you have a conclusion. My conclusion is the main point that I'm trying to convince my readers of, that if somebody is a human, they need water. And why am I saying this? Is because all humans need water to survive. Now listen to me, students. What is that extra statement which, if I add, will make this more strong, will make this more cemented? Why am I still saying that if someone is human, they need water? All humans need water to survive. This is the first reason. Is there a second piece of evidence or a fact? Because an assumption is an unstated premise that, if I include, will just make this seem a lot more understandable. And that is that the person referred to here is indeed a human. That is why you're saying if someone is human, they need water. You have two reasons for it. One is the premise, which is explicitly stated in the passage, which is all humans need water to survive. The second one, which is the hidden statement, which is what our assumption is, the person being referred to is indeed a human. You really have to be a human, and therefore if someone is human, they need water. This is the assumption. This is the most basic form of explanation that I can give to anybody, right? This is, assumption explained at its basic. So it's a very nice example, especially for beginners, for people who are not really comfortable with the idea of understanding a passage and thereby understanding assumptions. I think this is a good way to start. Now let me give you a classic example, and if you want, you can take a pause of 1 or 2 minutes. You can solve this on your own. I'm going to do this here for you. This is my argument. Now I'm not trying to tell you what the premise here is, what the conclusion here is. It is for you to understand. So this is my essentially argument. Many students who study late at night score well in the exams. Therefore, studying late at night improves performance. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in a step-by-step manner. I would want to identify my conclusion. How do I identify my conclusion? If there is a word that indicates that the statement is a conclusion, so here quite clearly you see the presence of therefore, which indicates that this is the main point that I'm trying to emphasize in the passage. Therefore, studying late at night, it improves the performance, right? And how have I arrived at my conclusion? What is the reason? What is that piece of evidence? What is the premise using which I've arrived at the conclusion is that, understand, many students who study late at night score well in the exams, and therefore we can safely say that if you study late at night, it will improve performance. Now, what is that missing piece of information which, if you insert after the premise, after the explicit premise, will make the entire conclusion seem all the more valid, right? So you have a premise and you have a conclusion, and your assumption needs to fill the gap. It needs to bridge the gap between the premise and a conclusion. You're saying studying late at night improves performance. Now, a quick tip. Ask yourself another question. But why am I still saying that studying late at night improves performance? If you can answer this question again, why am I still saying that studying late at night improves performance? You might possibly think, because ma'am, it already says many students who study late at night are able to perform well in exams. But why is this the case? Right? So maybe one reason can be that studying is really good for the functioning of your brain. If you study hard at night, when you study late in the night, you're burning the midnight oil, it actually maybe makes you feel a lot more, concentrated or focused on the task that is in front of you. So this can be an assumption, right? It's actually studying late which directly impacts your performance, and it's not because of some other factor. What if the student is already smart? That could be another factor, but here I'm trying to assume that studying is that quintessential thing. It's a sine qua non of performing well, studying in the night, right? It's a sine qua non of performing well in the examination, and therefore this is my assumption. You see how, if you just include this here, it makes the passage sound more understandable, more logical, more solidified, right? Studying caused the good performance. It is essentially studying which is a sine qua non of the good performance, not other factors like natural ability, which is like if the student is already smart, right? You don't need an exam to establish your worth, right? Or prior preparation. So this is essentially assumptions decoded for you with the help of a very good example. All right, now going forward, I would want to share some quick tips and rules for identifying assumptions, because very often, when we're in the flow of solving questions, we tend to deviate from the rules. But it's okay if you feel you're very efficient at it, you need not stick to the rules. But for ones who are, just at a very basic level, I think sticking to these rules might be of some help. All right. The first point here, look for the gap between the premise and the conclusion. The gap here essentially means what else can be inserted here to make the conclusion more, valid, more logical, stronger, right? If you're able to pre-think it, pre-think means, instead of looking at the options, just think as to, what is that option which if I include will make it a whole lot easier for me to understand the passage or the conclusion. Second is ask what must be true for the conclusion to hold. And this, according to me, because I have already showcased how this question really will help you identify the assumption properly. You have a premise or multiple premises, you have a conclusion. And then I did ask, with respect to the previous question, why is it still the case? Why is it that the conclusion still follows? Another reason, if you can think of, right? Why does the conclusion follow? Can you think of another reason which will bridge the gap between the premise and conclusion, which means it has to be logically related to the argument. Whatever option, which is your correct assumption, just ensure that it is logically related to the option or the passage, right? It should not be out of context. It should not be some extraneous information, all right? Because then the option gets distorted. All right, watch for common logical flaws, which means there are sometimes options that will contain quantifiers, which is what I mean by overgeneralization, right? So for example, if I take you back to the previous question, it says many students who study late at night score well in exams, therefore studying late at night improves a performance. Now, what if I gave you one option and you have to tell me if this is the assumption, which is every time if you study late in the night, you're going to improve your performance in the exams? No. Why? Because you're generalizing it. This is not an assumption. This is essentially not what is being implied also. It contains a quantifier every time. Or if you always study late in the night, you will do well in the exam. So tend to steer clear of such options containing quantifiers, right? Unstated necessary conditions, anything out of context that is given, you can choose to eliminate it. So obviously knowing the concept is really a nice way to, get started with doing well in CR, but at the same time always rely on elimination technique. All right. Next up, I have a very important technique which will help you identify the assumption correctly. But I will also give you a disclaimer here, students. This technique is more so to be used as a last resort because it's slightly technical in nature. If you just take a look here, it's a step-by-step thing that you'll have to do. Generally, when you're taking your CLATs, your mocks, or you're writing the actual paper, you will not be having that luxury of time. Let's just say for a question that I have displayed here, you should not be devoting more than 1.5 to 2 minutes to solving it. So you cannot just, waste time going through this in a step-by-step manner. This is again something that you can utilize right now as part of your preparation. So you become much more, efficient at solving assumption-based questions. So this is your assumption negation technique. What happens is, let's just say you have already zeroed in on an option which you feel is a correct assumption, and then you still are having doubts about its validity. So what you need to do is, whatever the assumption you think is actually the correct assumption, you negate it, which means you make it logically opposite. I will also explain this with the help of an example. And if after negating it, right, the entire conclusion falls apart, the conclusion weakens, the passage no longer, the argument no longer makes sense, that option is actually the correct option. Case in point is this example. Look here. The argument says, and this is my entire argument, drinking green tea improves concentration. Very simple. Drinking green tea improves concentration. If I have to figure out the assumption here without even looking at what the assumption is, can I say that drinking green tea might really have some benefits for your brain health? It might impact the functioning of your brain in a positive manner, so much so that the brain feels more concentrated and focused, right? So can I say, if I have to pre-think my option, my assumption will revolve around this point. The option should ideally be talking about how drinking green tea actually is beneficial. If I can speak about a certain benefit related to focusing or concentration. right? So quite clearly, this seems to be an apt assumption here, that green tea has ingredients that affect brain function, right? Now listen, let's attempt the assumption negation technique here. Let's just assume that we are lay persons and we're not really sure of this option being the correct assumption. So we are going to resort to the assumption negation technique. Step number 1, this is my assumption that's disputed. I'm going to negate it, which means I'm going to make it logically opposite. Green tea has ingredients that affect brain red. So after negation, this is what we have. Green tea has no ingredients that affect brain function. Now understand, if this were really the case, that green tea has no ingredients that affect brain function, will you really make this argument in the first place? You're already saying explicitly green tea has nothing in it that affects brain function. Then why will you even write the statement in the first place that drinking green tea improves concentration? When you negate your assumption, the correct assumption, and this also is negated, like this also falls apart, this actually means that this assumption is correct. So this is the utility of an assumption negation technique. Let's just say you still feel slightly dicey about an option that you have chosen, then you can resort to this assumption technique. So with this, we are done decoding assumptions. This is a basic level explanation. You have to solve a couple of more questions from your sectionals, from your test to get the hang of it, but I'm sure this will be helpful for beginners in assumptions. And obviously, if you just practice a lot more questions, solving challenging questions will also become a cakewalk. All right, so that's it for today's session. Hope you liked it. Thank you so much. You can connect with us on these platforms. Have a great day, everyone.